Fidel Castro, leader of the Cuban Revolution and the Caribbean islands' former president, was an iconic figure with a passionate belief in socialism and himself. He was a divisive character across the world, in Cuba, and even among his family. The defiant, cigar-chomping revolutionary who died aged 90 on the 25th of November 2016 was a source of both inspiration and derision throughout his 5 decades in power.
Fidel Castro was born in 1926. His father was a sugarcane farmer. Young Fidel grew up with the advantage of a wealthy farming family and entered the University of Havana Law School in 1945.
A sharp drop in sugar prices in 1884 resulted in U.S. interests buying out sugar estates and mining interests, so 90% of Cuban sugar went to U.S. refineries. The U.S. officials had their own ambitions on Cuba, which was a colony of Spain, so the U.S. tried to move in on the Spanish. After achieving independence in 1898, Cuba experienced a period of instability, revolts, and military intervention from the U.S. Batista, chief of the armed forces, and later the Cuban president, became more dependent on the U.S., allowing them to build military infrastructure like the naval base in Guantanamo Bay and to bring companies to Cuba.
Eventually, the sugar industry was in U.S. hands, with foreigners owning 70% of the urban land. As a result of the weak economic structure of Cuba, the American companies could easily further weaken and control Cuba's economy by adjusting the price of the resources. Owing to anger towards the imperialism of the US, nationalism in Cuba rose.
Nevertheless, Batista successfully created a puppet regime after his presidency and kept ruling Cuba for a long time, relying on the US. Due to the stimulation of nationalism and intervention from the US in Cuba, Castro became increasingly interested in politics in school. After graduation, he defended the poor in court and decided to run for parliament.
In 1952, Castro nominated as a parliamentary candidate. Batista, sensing he was losing popular support, led a military coup to seize power, and the parliamentary election was cancelled. After the coup, he jailed his opponents, used terrorist methods, contacted the mafia, and made fortunes for himself. Corruption and tyranny increased. Castro tried to challenge to Batista legally, demonstrating that the Cuban constitution had been violated by his power. When Cuban courts refused to hear him, Castro decided that legal assaults on Batista would never work. If he wanted to change and restore the politics in Cuba, he would have to use other means.
In July 1953, Castro led about 120 men in an attack on Moncada military camp in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed. Castro and his brother Raul were captured, and many of his men were killed. The US backed Batista, looking to improve his public image, released Castro in 1955 as part of an amnesty. Castro ended up in Mexico, where he met revolutionary Che Guevara and planned his return to Cuba. In May of 1958, Batista launched a massive campaign, but Castro's forces scored many unlikely victories over Batista's forces. On the 1st of January 1959, Batista fled the country.
Owing to the wrong strategy used by Batista and to the support from Cubans, Castro and his men won the war and finally marched into the capital, Havana. Castro soon implemented a Soviet-style communist regime in Cuba, much to the dismay of the US. From 1959 to 1966, Cuban insurgents fought a 6-year rebellion against the Castro government. The rebellion lasted longer and involved more soldiers than the Cuban Revolution. However, the rebellion was eventually put down and 3,000 rebels were executed.
Castro froze relations with the US by kicking out all the American companies and nationalizing the sugar plantations and mines. The US responded by putting an embargo on all trade and ships coming from Cuba. An embargo still in effect today, which has a huge effect on Cuba's economy, in which previously 2/3 of all imported goods came from the US. Therefore, Cuba became more dependent on the Soviet Union. This led to decades of conflicts between Cuba and the US. The first of these conflicts was the Bay of Pigs invasion.
In 1961, Castro defeated the invasion with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Cuban emigres orchestrated in the Bay of Pigs. The grimmest incident was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It happened in 1962. At that time, Soviet Union General Secretary Khrushchev was competing with US President Kennedy for nuclear missiles. The Soviet Union positioned missiles in Cuba, which was just next to the US. Many feared a nuclear war was unavoidable.
In the end, a secret treaty was signed between the USSR and the US. The missiles were removed from Cuba. Castro was very angry as he felt he had been betrayed by the Soviets. Cold War relations with the US persisted. Castro survived countless assassination attempts. Some put the number as high as 638. He gave up smoking cigars later due to his health, or maybe to prevent being killed by poisoned cigar. His brother-in-arms, Che Guevara, was later killed by the CIA in Bolivia during a revolution. How could he continue to rule in Cuba?
Under Castro's rule, literacy and life expectancy grew dramatically. Racism was eliminated. Health care was repaired and improved. Full employment was provided. He also introduced a work-study program, where students spent half their time studying and half working to help them learn job skills. New medical technologies like new cancer treatments and child vaccination were introduced.
In 1979, faced with economic downturn and civilian unrest, Castro told Cubans they could leave if they did not like the conditions at home. In 1980, 200,000 Cubans arrived in the US. After the dissolution of the USSR, Cuban immigration to the US climbed again. In 1996, the US stopped the immigration following the incident of the Cuban Five, spies who had infiltrated the US government.
Unlike Stalin or Mao, Castro didn't promote a cult of personality, so there was only a little propaganda about him in Cuba. During his rule, he diversified the economy, introducing environmental tourism and biotechnology. He strengthened his country by improving people's livelihood. but most importantly, suppressing the opposition forces. According to the WWF, Cuba became the first nation to meet sustainable development.
Later, in 2008, due to prolonged disease, Castro ceded his presidency to his brother, Raul Castro, to continue the communist regime.
US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the 50-year American policy toward Cuba had failed, and that US President Obama had to find ways to normalize Cuban-American relations. Obama eased the restrictions on American travel to the island. Cuban-American relations have been normalized since the 20th of July 2015. However, the embargo goes on.
Castro's death was announced on television and confirmed by his brother, Raul. Castro was laid to rest in the city of Santiago. To his opponents, Castro was a dictator who locked his people in a communist prison, where liberals and religious groups were suppressed. To his supporters, he was a revolutionary, an anti-imperialist, and a hero.
Unquestionably, Fidel Castro was one of the most remarkable political figures of his age. Nevertheless, there is no doubt Castro has retained a base of support in Cuba since his death. Huge rallies have been planned to mourn him.
Castro gave the country self-respect. There are no beggars. The people have a sense of pride. They can face their poor living conditions with dignity. They refuse to accept US hegemony. With the hard work of Castro and the Cubans, they can now boast free health care, a system which is better than the US, cancer treatment, biotechnology, first world levels of literacy and life expectancy, all without the support from the US.
Pre-Fidel Cuba had been little more than a banana republic. Under him, for better or worse, it mattered. Few countries, surely, have ever punched above their weight for so long, and few have been so dominated by a single man. Facing more international conflicts and the threat from the US, how would Cuba survive? Castro, a hero or a dictator? You decide.